incidents. Welcome our second panel. Welcome back once again, frequent flyer, Monsieur Perrault, who is the Chief Electoral Officer, Serge Caron, who's the Deputy Chief Electoral Officer for Digital Transformation Sector, and José Villeneuve, who's the Deputy Chief Electoral Officer, Regulatory Affairs. I invite you to give your opening statement, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, de m'avoir invité à comparaître.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for having invited me to appear before the committee as it studies foreign election interference. I will briefly discuss our preparation for the 45th general election, what we experienced with respect to electoral operations, as well as our efforts to address inaccurate information about the electoral process. Protecting elections against foreign interference requires a whole-of-society approach. While we administer federal elections and oversee the safeguards in the voting process, others, including security agencies, the Commissioner of Canada Elections, and political parties all have their own role to play in ensuring the security and integrity of an election. Our role in the delivery and protection of a federal election includes ensuring physical and personal security, the cybersecurity of our infrastructure, and the security of the information regarding the electoral process. In the lead-up and during the 45th general election, we continue to work closely with our security partners to understand potential threats and to secure our IT systems and the overall electoral process. And as I told the committee when I appeared in October, Elections Canada did not experience any breaches to its IT infrastructure or interference with its electoral operations during the election.
Recognized by the Commission on Foreign Interference, the biggest threat to our democracy comes from information manipulation, particularly through social media platforms. The role of Elections Canada in combating disinformation and misinformation is very specific but critical to the security of our electoral process and the trust of Canadians. During and between elections, Elections Canada is focused on providing Canadians with accurate information about the federal electoral process, not only so that they may exercise their right to vote, but also to inform them of the procedures and safeguards in place to ensure the integrity of the process. In preparation for the election and to counter information manipulation, we developed a range of information products as part of our voter information campaign. These include products available in 50 languages, as well as detailed content on electoral integrity. We also published a media guide for speakers of Mandarin, Cantonese, and Punjabi, the three most spoken languages in Canada besides English and French, with information on subjects that go beyond what we typically include in our information products, such as electoral security, National Register of Electors, and political financing safeguards. Based on testimonies heard before the Foreign Interference Commission and to prevent electors from being intimidated or influenced to vote a certain way or not to vote at all, we added new accessible web content about safeguards in the electoral process, including messages emphasizing the secrecy of the vote. These messages were shared widely through a range of communication channels during the 45th general election. In the lead-up to, as well as during the election, we monitored the public information environment to observe inaccurate narratives about the electoral process. In addition to monitoring traditional media, Elections Canada monitors 60 different platforms, news websites, blogs, and online forums in 22 different languages. I would note that Elections Canada is not equipped to determine whether the source of inaccurate information about federal elections is domestic or foreign. Instead, it focuses on the impact of the inaccurate information might have on Canadians' ability to register and vote or their trust in the electoral process. Though we did observe an increase in inaccurate narratives compared to previous elections, we were able to provide Canadians with easy access to information about the electoral process. We promptly corrected disinformation and misinformation through our various channels, such as our repository of official communications and our social media posts. And we did interact with social media platforms when appropriate regarding specific messages that we saw that were concerning. Toutefois, pendant la 45e élection générale,
However, during the 45th general election, we noticed a shift in the digital information ecosystem, the emergence of new elements, such as artificial intelligence and influencers, is changing the way in which Canadians have access to information about the electoral process and amplifies the manipulation and circulation of inaccurate information, whether domestic or foreign. This shift, in addition to the presence of other existing factors, such as polarization and the interconnectivity of the Canadian and American information environments, may lead to a situation where the information circulating online has long-lasting consequences on Canadians' trust in the electoral process. So prior to the election in November 2024, I presented to Parliament and to the Foreign Interference Commission a series of recommendations to better protect elections against threats, including from foreign actors. A key recommendation I made was to prohibit false information about the electoral process that is knowingly and deliberately being spread in order to interfere with the ability of Canadians to exercise their right to vote or to undermine trust in an election or its result. My other recommendations dealt with the use of deepfakes, the funding of third parties, and the protection of nomination and leadership contests. The Foreign Interference Commission endorsed most of my recommendations, including the ones I have mentioned here. Mr. Chair, I would encourage the committee, if it wishes, to consider these recommendations in its study of foreign interference. I would be happy to make my officials available to the committee should it wish to study those. Thank you. I will now answer your questions.
To Mr. Van Popta for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for being here, and Mr. Perrault for coming here once again, to our committee to engage in this very important study on the impact of foreign interference in our elections. And I think that we are all in full agreement that this is an extremely important topic. Commissioner Hogue, in her study, stated that information manipulation, quote, poses the single biggest threat to our democracy. It is an existential threat. I think you would agree with that from your earlier testimony. Earlier this week, we had witnesses come before us from the Critical Election Incident Protocol, Public Protocol Panel, and they would have underlined as well that this is a risk. And they expanded by saying foreign interference activities in Canada continue to be pervasive, sophisticated, and persistent. And just before you came here, in the earlier panel today, the minister quoted those same words. But despite that, the report, the retrospective report on the 45th general election, stated that, quote, none of the incidents of foreign interference reviewed by the panel threaten Canada's ability to free and fair elections. And when we put that to the witnesses earlier this week, they reaffirmed that. But they also pointed out that one of their goals is that, quote, Canadians must have full confidence that their election is secure. So that's my question to you. And I know in your testimony you talked a bit about that. The earlier witnesses were less equivocal with this answer in nice bureaucratic language, that the panel is encouraged that the public reactions to the enhanced communications posture adopted during GE45 viewed such efforts as generally effective. My question to you is, have we met the goal? Has the panel met the goal? Has your department met the goal of ensuring that Canadians have full confidence that their elections are in fact secure?
I think we have every reason to be confident in the overall security of our elections. I think we face challenges, like all democracies, but I think Canada checks all the boxes in terms of a free and fair election. I think some of the improvements that you noted for the last elections were positive improvements from my perspective, and overall I share the assessments that were made.
How can I be sure that that the public in my riding, which has a large Chinese diaspora community, are confident that they're not staying home because they're afraid of something? Would you have evidence to that? I'm not saying specifically for my riding, but any given riding, would you be able to say with some degree of assuredness that the public there is confident in our robustness of our democratic systems?
I think overall the surveys show that Canadians trust our electoral process, trust Elections Canada, that we are among the most trusted institutions in the country. So generally speaking, yes. Now I know there are pockets of distrust, and I think a lot of that distrust is based on incorrect information, and one of our key roles is to make sure that we provide as much as possible information about the safety of our electoral process. You mentioned something that is of concern to me, was of concern to me prior to the election, which I mentioned in my remarks, is people staying home because they're afraid. I think it's important for Canadians to know, and anybody who's listening, that the vote is secret. And how they vote is not something that can be determined by anybody. And so they should feel secure in going to the polling stations and casting a ballot, that it won't be known how they voted.
I agree that they should feel secure. And I believe that our systems are robust. But my concern continues to be with diaspora communities that feel threatened because of something that is going back on in the country from which they come. They still have family members and friends there.
And I share that concern, and that's why we launched a wide-ranging information campaign on the electoral safeguards. We also had some regional educators out in BC and Surrey and in Toronto to talk about the safeguards of our electoral process. We have a network of community groups that, with our Inspire Democracy program, with whom we share information. There's over 900 community groups that receive that information, and they in turn are well positioned to share that with members of their communities or people that they work with. So it's an important issue. I think there's no silver bullet to this. It's something that we need to tackle, and we need to continue expanding our efforts.
Thank you. 1 minute. I have a question about how new electors get their names put onto the list of electors. It's my understanding that it's pretty easy for a person to have their name entered on. When I'm out door knocking, people will go, "Oh, my daughter just turned 18. What should she do?" Go, "Well, you can go online, or you can go to the polling station, get there a couple of minutes early, and just show some ID." Now, showing a passport, of course, would be good enough, sufficient, but not necessary. Driver's license or anything else, other documents, even just like a library card if they don't have government-issued photo ID, almost anything is good enough. Are you assured that no non-Canadians are getting onto the voters list?
So we know that in some cases non-Canadians do get on the registrars list because we received the information from IRCC on non-Canadians, and we checked that against the register. After the fact. However,
casting their ballot immediately on getting on the voters list.
Correct, and there have been very, very few cases of prosecutions, people finding that there was elections fraud related to that. It's important for people to understand the critical balance between making the system accessible to ensure its integrity, because a system that rejects too many people who are entitled to vote is not a system that has integrity, and the controls that are in place. The vast majority.
So we're next round.
It was a good line of questioning. I wanted to hear the answer, but then he interrupted the really good answer, so I'll have to just cut it off there. We'll turn to Mr. Wilkinson.
Thank you again for appearing. You mentioned in your opening statement that you had made a number of recommendations with respect to some of the protections against foreign interference. I just want to explore a few of those. I think Elections Canada has highlighted some of the vulnerabilities with respect to third-party financing and also with respect to untraceable contributions. Maybe you can just speak to why are those a challenge at this point, and what would you suggest that we do?
So in my report, let's make sure that any potential loopholes for illicit funding be addressed. And we are concerned that if there are non-traceable instruments, prepaid credit card, for example, that are used to make contributions, that this does not provide a proper trace of where the money comes from. So I see no reason why we should allow these kinds of contributions in our system, and I've recommended that they be eliminated. I also recommended some changes to the third-party funding regime. Right now, third parties can use their own funds, and of course, in the case of individuals, that's appropriate. But what comes into a group's own funds can potentially be a range of sources, and we've seen increasingly third parties report their expenditures as being paid out of their own funds, and we don't know the original source of that money. So my recommendation is that in the case of groups, that if they want to use their own funds, that be limited to groups that receive 10% of their revenues from contributions. fundraising entities should not be able to use their own funds. So groups that largely depend on contributions need to set aside, or should need to set aside, a separate campaign bank account to receive contributions from Canadians and permanent residents.
Okay, and cryptocurrency?
Same thing. I mean, we don't see that a lot. It's not been a burning issue. We have issued guidelines on how to treat cryptocurrencies. We treat them as non-monetary contributions, the same as the UK has recently followed our own guidelines. But there's no really good reason at the end of the day to allow cryptocurrencies whose main feature is the inability to trace the sources.
Obviously, you folks are focused very much on general elections, but I do know that you have raised some issues and concerns and also some recommendations with respect to nomination races and leadership races, and maybe you can explain those.
So there's a number of recommendations that I've made in that area. I've not recommended, I think it's well known that we overtake the oversight of nomination races. I don't think that would be a wise avenue. But there are a number of offenses in the Act that pertain to the nomination, the electoral process, such as bribery. And we've seen allegations of bribery in other races in other jurisdictions, or threats. And I see no reason why these prohibitions should not equally apply to nominations or leadership races. So that's one area of recommendations. I also think more transparency overall in the rules pertaining to leadership and nominations is warranted. And I did recommend that parties, in the case of leadership and nomination races, that they ascertain that their members who vote, that they have at least permanent residence.
Okay. Obviously, one of the big topics of conversation these days is the emerging importance of artificial intelligence. And associated with that are concerns relating to things like deepfakes. Maybe you can explore the issues that are there, but also some of the ways in which you think we can protect to ensure the integrity of the process.
Yes. So there was a lot of concern coming into the last election that we would see, and not just in Canada, in other elections around the world, deepfakes as a major threat. We have seen deepfakes, but I don't think it's the threats or the dangers have yet materialized. I think you've heard witnesses before me that are of the view, and I share that view, that it continues to be a risk, that the manipulation of voices and images could deeply mislead electors, and the sophistication that comes with AI increases that risk. It's very cheap. It's easily accessible to anybody. So we have to expect that it's going to come. I don't know that there's a magical solution to deal with that, but there are elements. I do believe that it would be appropriate to have a watermark, basically a marker, whenever AI is used in the production of electoral communications. At the very least, if it becomes unlawful to not put that label, platforms' own moderation policies, which typically include taking down unlawful content, could act upon that immediately. So it creates additional leverage. Of course, it does create more transparency for Canadians. I also think that there should be some very narrow but specific prohibitions on misrepresentations of political actors or of the chief electoral officer using, by any means, but manipulating of the voice or of the image to have them say things they haven't said or put them in context where they haven't been.
Okay. How much time do I have? 40 seconds. So you've made a range of recommendations, as have a number of other bodies. Of the various recommendations that you have made, which do you see as being the most pressing moving forward?
It's hard to point to a particular one. I think it's a matter of looking at every options that we have to combat foreign interference. But I am concerned, and I mentioned that in my remarks, about the fact that people can, with impunity, deliberately put forward false information about the electoral process, and can do so with the very specific intent of either preventing people from voting, though there are existing rules that we could use against that, but undermining confidence in the election. And we saw that, and I think you've heard from witnesses after this election, AI produced content showing or purporting to show poll workers stealing ballots. And to me, this is the very kind of harm that we need to find remedies against before it's too late.
Thank you so much. Madame Normandin, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup. Encore une
Thank
fois,
you very much. Once again, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to hear your perspective on foreign interference in view of what we heard earlier this week. I don't know if you had the opportunity to listen to people from the site task force. There was an interesting question that was asked by my colleague Blaine Calkins. He mentioned in his premise that site task force was like a fire alarm. It's very good for analyzing the presence of smoke, a good team on the ground to analyze metadata to see potential interference, but perhaps less able to diffuse them to make that information known to the public. And that seems to be one of your strengths in your presentation. In your opening comments, you talked about your interaction on social media. There's the credibility of your role, the Chief Electoral Officer. So I'd like to hear about the collaboration or the lack of collaboration between the Chief Electoral Officer and the site task force. Do you operate in silos, or is there collaboration, respecting, of course, the independence of both entities? But are you communicating, and should you be communicating more? There is daily communication through my colleague here, daily communication with members of the site task force. So there are meetings every day, and we share all of our information. So, of course, the challenge I have, my mandate is very specific. We talked about the credibility of Elections Canada. Intervening in the area of misinformation and disinformation is extremely delicate. We could be accused of censorship. When you're talking about information about the electoral process, it's a lot easier. Misinformation and disinformation about candidates, platforms, that's much more delicate. That's not our role. It's a challenge that's much greater. That's more about educating people, efforts over time, and to inform people. I think that's the role of public safety agencies. We had technical briefings during the election to raise people's awareness of situations so they can have a critical view on content. Thank you very much. I'd like to hear your perspective on the importance of the Foreign Influence Registry and your role, and more specifically, access to the minister. We know that it's possible through contributions to meet with a minister or prime minister during an event. In the past, we've seen events where that led to signing of contracts with the Bank with China. So the registry, would that facilitate your role in analyzing what could be foreign interference, or to better examine access to ministers through donations? There would be a more critical view by the public, by journalists and ministers who may not know who is present. A politician meets people from all backgrounds in their writing. So a registry could lead to transparency, and we could know who is working for foreign interests. Are those people making donations? Are those people working on campaigns, political campaigns? So I think transparency is good for the whole system. In large part, the Canada Elections Act is built on transparency, on the transparency of donations. There are very strict rules when it comes to fundraising at special events to meet ministers to have that transparency. So in my view, it's part of the same approach, and I think it's a good thing. Once again, on the matter of access, in Quebec, we've thought about the maximum amount that entities can contribute. Is this something that should be part of what we look at lowering the ceiling for donations and looking at names that are borrowed, money from third parties, which is more difficult to trace? You talked about cryptocurrency. Would it be good to have a look at the ceiling, the cap? To me, this is something that's up to Parliament. If we look around the world, we have one of the strictest systems. I know in Quebec at the provincial level, it's even stricter. But when we look around the world, we're one of the strictest systems. Until recently, Australia had anonymous donations of up to $10,000. That's not us. We have a very robust system, and I think it's up to Parliament to regularly review that to see if that balance is a good one. We need to ensure that candidates and political parties can fund their activities, so there's a balance that needs to be found with donation caps. I'll use my 30 seconds later. Thank you.
5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Wonderful to see you again. Thank you for being here. Just very quickly to start off, you mentioned that the percentage of people who are removed from the voters list is very small. I wondered if you would commit to providing a riding-by-riding breakdown of people who have been, the number of people who have been removed from the voters list who are not eligible to vote per constituency.
I can, but it will not be the way you phrased it, in the sense that when we have information that someone, according to CIC, or according to the IRCC, is not a Canadian citizen, this is not a conclusive evidence, so it may or may not be accurate. There may be errors. People who join, who are on the register, have all affirmed, in affirmation solennelle, that they have Canadian citizenship. And so these are cases where we do have conflicting evidence, the evidence of the person who has attested that they have a citizenship and bureaucratic information that says that they are not. And when we match that, we do take them out and we inform them that they've been removed. It may be an error, and we offer them the opportunity to join back, but the regime as it exists allows people to come in on polling day and, as was indicated earlier, and to affirm formally that they are Canadian citizens. And if they lie about that, then there are potential serious consequences.
Sure, and I think that's fair. We're not asking you about what happens before the vote. I'm just curious if we can get a sense of the number.
We can, but I would caution not to assume that everybody who's been removed is not a citizen. That would be erroneous.
Okay, fair enough. I am a little bit concerned that the main point of contention is IRCC's database. Like, it's very publicly well known that the immigration system is an absolute disaster. We have no idea who's a citizen, who's here on PR status, who's on a temporary foreign worker permit. Like, these guys have lost complete control of the immigration system. So if that's the only database that you're using, and I understand that you're limited in the available data points that you have at your disposal, but if that's the sole piece, so I just wonder if that's a concern that Elections Canada has in the status of that database and that it's deeply flawed.
I would say that the quality of the data, as far as we are aware, has greatly improved over time. The information that we receive, yes, it has. I would also inform the committee that, to my knowledge, we are the only jurisdiction that I know of that does this data matching with immigration data. Most democracies do not have documentary proof of citizenship for a good reason. I can speak to that. But they do not also do that cross-reference with immigration data. So I think what we have in Canada is one of the most robust systems that exist, and it's important not to make it so robust that it excludes legitimate Canadians from voting. So there's a balance here that needs to be struck.
I just wonder for the average Canadian out there that thinks, well, I can get a driver's license and it doesn't matter. The vast majority of people that go to vote use their driver's license. And so if you have that, I guess the question is, what guarantee can you give them that there is some ratification confidence? I mean, they cast their ballot, it might get removed later. Are you doing recounts in those seats? I mean, we've got seats that were won by 1 vote, 4 votes. And so in the case where you remove a voter after their ballot's been cast from the list, is then a recount required in that seat if it's such a tight margin? I mean, I'm just curious how that works.
So the law
Provides that if any citizens believes that the election has been affected, the results have been affected by reason of fraud, that they can contest the election. So it's up to the losing candidate or any other citizen based on evidence that they could provide, including, of course, prosecutorial evidence if somebody is charged that the results have been affected. Then a court could overturn the election. But that would be the role of a court, not the role of Elections Canada.
It would be very onerous for a candidate after they've run an election campaign and lost, and then 4 months later, or whatever the timeline is, they find out that in a one-vote split seat, they find out that a vote was cast erroneously by an individual, whether it was intentional or not, and then they pursue a court decision to ask for the election result to be redone. I mean, so I'm just confused why the onus would be on the losing candidate then in a situation where this happens.
Very quick answer, please.
Any Canadian can contest an election based on evidence that the results were impacted by fraud. But you're right, there is an onus that comes with that.
Thank you so much. Madame Kayabaga for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, I'd like to welcome Monsieur Perrault again. Thank you for taking the time to continue to engage on these very important conversations. I did hear you earlier. My colleague had asked you questions around financing in elections. You kind of talked about the problems around potentially foreign financing. Can you mention maybe some other systems that you have not been able to share with us in ways that we can protect nominations and general elections around any foreign financing?
I think the committee should be aware that we have a very good system overall, but there are elements that can be improved. For instance, the law prohibits someone from using a third party, for instance, from using foreign funds, but not necessarily a foreign entity for making that contribution. Or the law prohibits the provision of money by foreign entities, but does not include non-monetary contributions. So there are refinements that need to be made to the regime to improve it that I've made in my recommendations report.
And just for the record, because I think a couple of people have asked you this question around the trust that the public needs in order to get out and vote and not fear for any other foreign influencer that may kind of know they're voting. And we know that Elections Canada is very good at protecting the voters. There's privacy involved. But for the record, just because that question's been asked a couple of times, and when we politicians talk about certain things, I think that the public begins to worry about the wrong thing. Can you just put on the record that what you think about privacy and electors and...
So I can assure anybody that it is not possible for someone for someone to know who voted for which candidate. When you vote in person on a regular ballot, the ballot is folded in such a way that the elector is instructed to return it with and it's pre-folded to facilitate that, to cover the name of the candidate that the person has voted for. And there are, of course, scrutineers around to make sure that the process is followed properly. And we do have audits of the election that look into ensuring that this is done properly. When you look into voting by special ballot, when we receive the ballot, they are protected by secrecy envelopes. So we have to separate the envelopes before we can put the secrecy envelopes. The outer envelope contains information about the voter. The inner envelope contains no information. They're separated and counted only once that separation has taken place. So there are controls in places, and most importantly, witnesses to the count to make sure these controls are applied.
I appreciate you putting that on record, because I think it's really important that the public is not misinformed about what happens when they go to the ballot box. Earlier this week, I was able to ask a question to your other colleagues that were here, not per se colleagues, but other people who work in that space, and I was asking around the markers on AI transparency, whether we should move towards making everyone who uses AI, especially if they're posting on a public platform, to put that marker to kind of indicate to the consumer that they are consuming AI information. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I say my thoughts have evolved on that. I was skeptical at the outset. I think now that it should be a requirement, and that's been my recommendation. I think people who use AI in good faith, and there are many people who do that, will not hesitate to put the marker, and people should become educated as they see those markers to AI content. Now, obviously, someone could try to cheat and not put the marker, but that's where I think that the marker also is important, is that once it can be determined that it was AI content, for that reason alone, it becomes illegal content, and platforms normally would take it down. And so it provides a lever to prevent attempts to influence, improperly influence the vote that we currently do not have.
I don't have a lot of seconds left, but I'll just, maybe say this. I agree with you. I think that the markers are really important, not just for elections, but also for other uses where we see children being vulnerable and women. Deepfakes are taking over. So I appreciate you putting that on the record and sharing that your thoughts have evolved since I last asked you this question. Thank you very much. Any other comment that you would like to put on the record in 5 seconds?
Excellent. And then that's exactly 5 minutes. Wonderful. Madame Normandin, 3 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. You talked about this a bit already in response to Mr. Wilkinson's questions, but I'd like to hear about anti-brownies measures. This was very relevant in Quebec, and this is a recommendation you've made in the past, to have something to prohibit bribes, threats, attempts to interfere in a voting process for nomination and leadership races. But I see when you made your recommendation in November 2024, you also referred to foreign influence and foreign interference. So could you provide examples? How could there be foreign interference in nomination and leadership races? What comes to mind? How could that be prevented by legislation? I think we need to have transparency. It needs to be beforehand and not after. I'm talking about nomination races. With leadership races, there's notice ahead of time, but not with nomination races. So we need transparency. We need transparency in the rules. It's not Elections Canada. Parliament, I think, has to let parties determine their own rules, but transparency is a good thing. And I think the measures we've talked about, it's a little shocking. Shocking it's not already prohibited. It's prohibited for elections, but not for nomination races. So fraud. These are things that could serve foreign states. We've seen allegations of intimidation in the electoral process. It could happen in nomination races. We know there are ridings in Canada which usually go to one political party or another. So the nomination race is really the door to get into the political system in Canada. So it's important to have those basic protections so that foreign actors and states don't seek to influence elections through nomination races. Thank you very much. So this would be done as a complement to the recommendations you've already made on setting out the rules ahead of time for leadership races, to have financial accounts. So that might not be enough. We would also need to have measures to prevent officially bribes and threats, etc. These are tools for investigations. When there are tools, when there are prohibitions, there could be search warrants, for example, work that could be done that can't be done if it's not prohibited. Thank you very much.
Mr. Cooper for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Perrault, just following up on the line of questioning from Mr. Jackson, to be clear, is the only database that Elections Canada has to verify if someone who is on the list shouldn't be on the voters list the IRCC database, or are there other sources of data?
We have roughly 40 data partners, drivers, income tax, for example, provincial electoral management bodies who share information that allow us to update the register of electors. But whenever people enter the register, at some point in the process, they will have had to have made a sworn statement to the effect that they are qualified as an elector.
So someone can declare that they are a citizen, but the question is what verification processes are in place to ensure that that is, in fact, the case. And you have said you have data sources. And so if someone, for example, is identified as someone who appears to not be eligible to vote, what is then the process? What would happen next?
They are removed from the register of electors,
Okay.
and they no longer receive a voter information card, for instance. If it is found that they have voted, so if they do register and vote, then they are referred to the Commissioner of Canada Elections.
And what if, for example, someone who was removed from the list showed up at a polling station and someone vouched for them, or if they're not on the list at all and someone vouched for them, are there any checks and balances, processes in place to ensure that someone who shouldn't be voting doesn't end up casting a ballot?
So they are required to provide documentary proof of their identity and address, or have somebody who's provided such proof of their own to vouch for them. So this is about identity and address. In terms of the citizenship, it is a sworn statement. This is the rule across most democracies in the world. Very few, and for very good reason, do not require documentary proof of citizenship. And it's important to understand that such requirements can lead to the exclusion of vast numbers of electors.
But I mean, you also, well, it's one thing, and we certainly wouldn't want anyone to be excluded, but we're talking about 1 vote, 4 votes. If someone who votes who shouldn't vote, that cancels out a vote.
But the
I'm
reverse
going to
is
turn it
also
over
true.
to another issue, which is third-party financing. And, Commissioner, there are significant loopholes with respect to the financing of registered third parties that participate in our elections in terms of the possibility of foreign sources of funding. And as I understand it, as the law currently stands right now, is that a foreign entity or source could donate to a Canadian entity, and that Canadian entity in turn could donate those funds to a registered third party, and they would be treated as having been made from that Canadian entity. Is that right? Okay. So it seems to me that the most straightforward and effective way to stop the use of foreign money to influence our elections through third parties, which has happened, would be to require third parties to set up specific bank accounts for the purpose of engaging in activities during elections in which the funds donated to those accounts would be restricted to individual Canadian citizens. That would close any loophole, and it would put third parties on par with registered political parties to the extent that registered political parties can only accept contributions from individual Canadians. What are your thoughts on that recommendation?
I would say it is close to the recommendation I've made, but there's an important nuance. My view is that there are groups who have money from different sources whose main purpose is not to participate in an election, who at the election time may find out that there is an issue in the election that is of deep concern to them or their members, and that they may wish to participate. And to completely prevent them from using any of their existing funds could be an overly restrictive regime. So that's my recommendation, is to allow those who are not fundraising groups to use their own funds, as well as individuals. But I understand your point of view. It's a matter of striking the right balance.
Okay. Thank you so much. We'll turn to Mr. Lewis. 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Monsieur Perrault, Monsieur Caron, Madame Villeneuve. Your repeated testimony and work shows that Elections Canada has an important role in safeguarding the integrity of our electoral process and maintaining that public confidence in democratic outcomes here in Canada. I appreciate that. Monsieur Perrault, you mentioned, there's a constant battle countering digital misinformation. You mentioned steps that you take, you're calling it out, and debunking, for lack of a better word, and doing outreach and posting. Can you expand on some of the ways that you're doing that?
Certainly. So we've moved from debunking, which we continue to do, to also pre-bunking. So what we do is, first of all, we seed as much correct information in the system, the ecosystem, as possible prior to an election. So we want to make sure that there's as much understanding of the rules and process as possible. What we've begun to do ahead of the last election was something called electoral facts, where we single out false narratives ahead of time because we monitor across jurisdictions and across events, and we identify them and provide the correct factual information on that. So we proactively tell Canadians, beware of these narratives. This is the correct information. And then of course, during the election, we can correct, and we do correct information. And in some cases, we do speak to platforms. There were, for example, in the last election, a fake media, Journal de Montréal article saying that for seniors, people over age 65, the vote is on a Tuesday, not the Monday. And so it was posted, I believe, on polling day. And so we immediately contacted platforms, and they did take it down. We didn't have to ask them to take it down. They moved quickly on that.
That's speed. The need to move quickly is a challenge. Another challenge might be that people on social media are, in a way, in echo chambers. They might not be in the same circle that you're posting that, or debunking or pre-bunking the information. What challenges do you have to reach when social media today seems to be so segmented that people are seeing the news they want to see?
It does raise challenges, and we have to think about, on what platforms do we want to be? And some platforms may not be as reputable as others. But if Canadians are there, then we have to decide, should we go there? Should we be on those platforms? And we tend to err on the side of being there and sharing as widely as possible correct information. We have seen, while there are echo chambers, it's fair to say that we've also seen people correcting each other and people using some of our information that we put out. And that was very encouraging to see, that people actually are using our information to respond to other participants in the conversation.
So then, let's call it off-season or non-election time. Is there outreach that can be done to Canadians? So Canadians, let's use this as a public service announcement. How can Canadians find out where to turn if they're in question?
There's a range of tools. Of course, they can contact us, but we do have a lot of information on our website. We also have documents, information products that we provide to a network. I spoke about that a bit earlier. The program's called Inspire Democracy, and we have over 900 participants. These are civic groups that use that information. It includes political parties. And then these groups in turn can share that information with their members or people who are close to them. So there's a range of tools, and you're quite right that this is not something that can only happen during an election. We really need to be ahead of the curve.
New phrase, Inspire Democracy. I shall be looking that up. That sounds like the motto of Elections Canada. I was going to ask a question about you discussing with other countries what information sharing happens, what we can learn when elections in similar countries happen. Is there communication? And then at the same time, you mentioned that our system is so robust, so strong. Is it possible other countries are also learning from us?
Yeah, so, I mean, one forum that I like to attend is very informal, but we have this forum called Four Countries, which is Australia, New Zealand, UK, and Canada. We're very much alike in terms of where we are, in terms of mature democracies. And we share our concerns and practices and how we're evolving. So, the example that I gave of ElectoFact, which pre-bunks, is a takeoff from what Elections Australia did previously, though in a different way and in a way that we probably wouldn't do it. There are cultural differences, but we do talk about what we do and learn from each other.
For inspiring democracy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lewis. I was subbing into a committee, and I noticed that the chair of that committee asked a question of all witnesses each time there was a panel. And I'm not going to get into that, but I do have a couple of questions and use my discretion. Chair's prerogative. Because I'm having some flashbacks from my last time on PROC when we were dealing with the repeal of the so-called Fair Elections Act. And I do think it comes from a good place in terms of protecting the Section 3 charter rights of Canadians to ensure that there is fair voting. And I agree with Mr. Cooper when he says he wouldn't want anyone excluded. But we've seen from past attempts from a previous government to bring in voter ID laws under the so-called Fair Elections Act, that it made it more difficult for seniors, Indigenous people, people with disabilities to vote. And I remember hearing testimony that, and perhaps this is anecdotal from those witnesses, that up to 250,000 Canadians who should have been eligible to vote were disenfranchised during that time. I was wondering if you can comment on the difficulties of those voter ID laws and the impact. I believe that would have been the 42nd general election.
I would like to preface that, if I may, by the statement that excluding an elector who has the right to vote is equally harmful to the integrity of the election than allowing somebody who should not. And the evidence that we have tends to show that there are very, very few non-electors who do vote, but that there are significant segments of the population who face barriers to vote. And so when we look at legislation to ensure the integrity of the electoral process, the integrity is a mix of those two considerations. If legislation unduly excludes people by imposing requirements that cannot be met by large segments of the population, then it is detrimental to the integrity of the electoral process. In the same way that if it is too lax. And so there's a fine tuning that needs to take place. And over the years, Parliament has turned its mind to different ways in which to find that balance. I think it's fair to say that changes that were brought in did create some restrictions. There was evidence, there was a labor survey that was done I believe after the 2011 election that showed that there was a number of electors who struggled to demonstrate their proof of address, and changes were made. And I think it's properly, it's a good thing that it's an evolving conversation about what is that right balance. But it's always important to remember when we talk about integrity that it's not just excluding people who shouldn't vote, but it's also making sure that those who should be able to vote actually have that opportunity. And if there's a risk, both elements have to be taken into account.
And perhaps this is an unfair question to you and should be directed at the Commissioner. How many prosecutions were there this past election that you're aware of, or you can get back
I mean,
to
this is an ongoing process, so and I can't speak to that. But yeah, I'm not aware for this election of any. If you're talking about electors who voted that should not have, yes. I'm not aware of a single one.
Thank you so much. Okay, that's our time. This committee is adjourned.